76-year-old Margaret Ellis loses her beloved lakeside home after hidden medical debts from her late husband's illness leave her bankrupt. If you want to know what happened next, keep watching this story of survival. To watch more stories like this, don't forget, subscribe and press bell icon. Margaret Ellis believed that a quiet life was a kind of blessing most people only understood after they lost it. At 76 years old, she lived in a small white cottage at the edge of a sleepy lakeside town where mornings arrived slowly, wrapped in pale fog and birdsong. Her house was old enough to creak when the wind changed direction, but she loved every inch of it: the faded blue shutters, the little stone path lined with lavender bushes, the curtains she had sewn herself nearly 30 years earlier, stitched carefully beside her husband while he listened to jazz records on rainy evenings. Every morning, Margaret woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. She would slide her feet into soft wool slippers, tie her silver hair into a loose knot, and walk into the kitchen, where the smell of old cedar and cinnamon still lingered in the walls. She always made coffee the same way: 2 scoops, a pinch of nutmeg, a cracked ceramic mug with tiny painted daisies on the side. Then she would sit on the porch with a blanket over her knees and watch the lake wake up. There were ducks that glided across the water every morning at nearly the same time. There was a fisherman named Walter who waved from his tiny boat no matter the weather. There was the soft, distant ringing of the church bell at 7 o'clock sharp, and there had once been Henry. Even after 4 years without him, Margaret still turned her head sometimes when she heard footsteps behind her. 48 years of marriage did that to a person. His absence was no longer sharp like a knife. It was quieter now, like an empty chair that remained part of the room. She still talked to him sometimes while watering the flowers. "You would have hated this humidity," she whispered one afternoon, brushing dirt from her fingers. The neighbors loved her because she remembered birthdays, baked peach pies during the summer festival, and knitted scarves every winter for children whose parents couldn't afford proper coats. Margaret never had children of her own, but there was something motherly in the way she listened to people. She made others feel less alone simply by standing beside them. On Thursdays, she volunteered at the small public library. Children gathered around her for story hour because she gave every character a different voice. Even teenagers who pretended not to care would linger nearby, secretly listening. Her favorite place in the house was the attic. Most people found it dusty and cramped, but Margaret found comfort there. Old trunks filled with photographs, boxes of handwritten recipes, Henry's woodworking tools resting exactly where he left them. The attic smelled like old paper and winter sweaters, and when rain tapped against the roof, it felt almost sacred. One evening in early autumn, Margaret climbed those attic stairs, carrying a basket of folded blankets. Outside, the wind had begun shaking loose the first amber leaves from the trees. She set the basket down and noticed a small leak near the window. "Oh dear," she sighed softly. The roof had been aging for years. Henry used to fix things before they became problems. Since his death, the house seemed to age faster, as though it missed him too. Margaret placed a bucket beneath the drip and looked around the attic slowly. The room suddenly felt different that night. Colder, somehow. She sat on an old trunk and rubbed her hands together. You might wonder how someone who lived such a gentle life could possibly lose everything. The truth is, disaster rarely announces itself loudly at first. Sometimes it begins with something as small as a leak in the roof. Margaret did not know that within 6 months she would stand outside her beloved cottage, carrying only one suitcase. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of life. How ordinary the final peaceful evening can seem before everything changes forever. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, tucked between grocery coupons and a church bulletin. Margaret almost ignored it. The envelope looked official, stamped with a bank logo she barely recognized. She opened it while standing in the kitchen beside simmering soup. At first, the words made no sense. Past due, foreclosure proceedings, final notice. Margaret frowned and adjusted her glasses. Her heartbeat slowed strangely. like her body refusing to understand what her eyes were seeing. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. Henry had handled most of the finances before he passed away. After his death, Margaret continued paying bills the same way she always had, trusting the routine more than understanding it. She knew little about mortgages or interest rates. The cottage had belonged to Henry's family for decades. She believed it was safe, but it wasn't. 2 years earlier, during Henry's final illness, they had quietly refinanced the home to pay hospital costs Margaret never fully understood. Henry had hidden much of the stress from her because he wanted her final memories of him to remain gentle. Now the debt had grown like vines in darkness. Margaret sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The soup boiled over unnoticed behind her. That afternoon, she walked 3 blocks to the bank under a sky heavy with rain. The young man behind the desk spoke kindly, but his voice carried the distant tone of someone discussing numbers rather than lives. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Ellis," he said carefully. "The payment stopped several months ago." "I've paid every bill," Margaret replied. He showed her statements she barely understood. Medical debts, interest, penalties. Her hands trembled lightly. "There must be another option." The young man hesitated. "If the balance isn't resolved within 60 days, the property will legally transfer." Property. Such a cold word for a home filled with birthdays and grief and decades of love. Margaret nodded politely because she had been raised to remain dignified in public. Then she walked out into the rain without opening her umbrella. The lake looked darker that evening. Over the next weeks, Margaret tried everything she could think of. She sold Henry's old watch. She stopped buying fresh fruit. She canceled the tiny luxuries that made life feel warm, but the debt was far beyond her reach. She called distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. Most conversations ended with uncomfortable silence. One nephew promised to see what he could do and never called back. Another suggested she move into a retirement facility before things became too difficult. Margaret thanked everyone politely after each conversation. Then she sat quietly in the kitchen afterwards, staring at the wallpaper, while the clock ticked loudly in the silence. At night, she stopped sleeping well. She wandered through the cottage, touching things absent-mindedly. Henry's old sweater hanging behind the bedroom door. The carved wooden banister he built himself. Tiny pencil marks inside the pantry where they once measured visiting nieces and nephews as children. One evening, her neighbor Clara brought over blueberry muffins. "You look tired," Clara said gently. Margaret smiled too quickly. "Just not sleeping much lately." Clara studied her face. "Something's wrong." Margaret wanted to say it aloud. She wanted someone to tell her it would all somehow be fine, but pride can be a lonely thing, so she simply said, "I'm managing." The eviction notice arrived 6 weeks later. Margaret opened it alone. The paper shook in her hands, while sunlight poured through the kitchen curtains, warm and golden and completely indifferent to human suffering. She packed slowly over the next several days, not because she owned so much, because every object carried a memory. Henry's reading glasses, a chipped Christmas ornament, a faded recipe card stained with tomato sauce from some long-forgotten dinner party. She cried only once. It happened while folding one of Henry's flannel shirts. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar after all those years. Margaret pressed it against her face and sat on the bedroom floor, trembling silently. No dramatic sobbing, no angry shouting, just the quiet sound of a heart breaking carefully so nobody else would hear it. On her final morning in the cottage, Margaret woke before dawn as usual. Habit survived even when everything else fell apart. She made coffee one last time. The house echoed strangely now without furniture. Even the clock had been packed away. Margaret stood in each room before leaving: the kitchen, the bedroom, the attic. She rested her hand against the attic wall for several long seconds. "Goodbye," she whispered. Outside, a cold wind moved across the lake. Clara cried openly while helping load Margaret's suitcase into an aging taxi. "You can stay with me," Clara insisted again. But Margaret shook her head softly. "No, I need to figure things out." The truth was more painful. She could not bear becoming someone else's burden. The taxi drove away slowly. Margaret looked back once at the cottage growing smaller behind her. And for the first time in 76 years, she no longer knew where home was. The boarding house smelled faintly of bleach, old cooking oil, and loneliness. Margaret rented the smallest room on the 3rd floor because it was all she could afford after paying the remainder of her debts. The wallpaper peeled near the ceiling, and the radiator clanged loudly through the night like pipes groaning in pain. The bed was narrow, the window faced an alley. Still, Margaret folded her sweaters neatly into drawers and placed Henry's photograph beside the lamp, as though arranging familiar objects could somehow soften the sharpness of loss. Days became smaller after that, smaller meals, smaller conversations, smaller hopes. Margaret found temporary work mending clothes at a dry cleaning shop owned by a tired man named Samuel, who rarely smiled, but always paid her on time. Her fingers still moved skillfully with a needle, despite the arthritis in her knuckles. She worked quietly beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, while younger employees laughed together nearby. Sometimes they forgot she was there. Old people often become invisible long before they disappear completely. At lunchtime, Margaret sat alone behind the building, eating crackers or soup from a thermos. She counted every dollar carefully. Rent, medicine, bus fare. One rainy evening, she stood in a grocery store holding a single apple for nearly 5 minutes before placing it back because it cost too much. The cashier pretended not to notice. That kindness nearly made Margaret cry. Winter arrived early that year. Cold air slipped through cracks in the boarding house windows, and Margaret wrapped herself in layers of sweaters at night to stay warm. She stopped volunteering at the library because the bus ticket felt extravagant now. The children asked about her. She never knew that. One Sunday, she walked past the lake where her cottage once stood. A construction fence surrounded the property now. Workers were tearing down parts of the porch Henry built with his own hands. Margaret stood there, silently gripping the fence until her fingers turned white. A young worker glanced at her. "Ma'am, you can't stand here." She nodded and walked away without explaining. That night, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the wall for hours. You might think heartbreak arrives in one terrible moment. Sometimes it arrives in tiny pieces instead. A missing porch light, an empty mailbox, no one waiting for you at dinner. The worst evening came in February. Snow fell heavily outside while icy wind rattled the thin windows of the boarding house. Margaret returned from work exhausted and aching from the cold. She discovered a notice taped to her door, informing residents that heating costs were increasing immediately. Another payment, another worry. Inside her room, the light bulb flickered weakly overhead. Margaret sat at the tiny table and emptied her purse. Coins rolled across the wood surface. She counted them twice, then a third time. Not enough. She lowered her face into her hands. For a long while, she simply sat there, listening to the storm outside. A terrible thought entered quietly. Maybe this was all that remained. Maybe life had already finished with her. Margaret looked toward the window, where snow blurred the world into white emptiness. Her chest felt hollow with exhaustion. There are moments when loneliness becomes physical, like carrying stones inside your body. She opened the bedside drawer slowly. Inside rested Henry's old pocket watch and a bottle of sleeping pills prescribed months earlier. Her fingers hovered there. The room was silent except for the wind, and then something very small happened. From somewhere downstairs came the faint sound of music, a piano, uneven notes at first, then a soft familiar melody, Moon River. Henry used to play that song terribly on rainy evenings, missing half the notes while laughing at himself. Margaret froze. The music drifted upward through old pipes and creaking floors, imperfect, fragile, human. Without understanding why, tears suddenly filled her eyes. She closed the drawer gently. Then she sat by the window and listened until the song ended. The next morning, Margaret discovered the piano belonged to a young woman named Elena, who rented a room downstairs while attending nursing school. "You play beautifully," Margaret told her shyly. Elena laughed. Not really. I mostly practice because it reminds me of my grandmother. Something softened inside Margaret hearing those words. Over the following weeks, Elena occasionally brought Margaret tea or helped carry groceries upstairs. Small acts. But when a person has been starving emotionally, even tiny kindnesses feel enormous. Still, life remained difficult. Margaret's eyesight worsened from stress and fatigue. Samuel reduced her hours at the dry cleaning shop after business slowed. Some nights she skipped dinner entirely. Yet a faint spark survived somehow. One afternoon, Elena found Margaret sewing a torn coat sleeve by hand. "You're incredible at that," Elena said. Margaret smiled faintly. "I used to make nearly all my own clothes years ago. You should teach people." Margaret chuckled softly. Who would want lessons from an old woman? Elena looked genuinely confused. A lot of people. Margaret dismissed the idea immediately. But later that night, while lying awake listening to the wind, those words returned to her. A lot of people. She had spent so long believing her usefulness ended when her old life disappeared that she forgot something important. Loss can strip away comfort. It can steal homes and certainty and people we love. But sometimes, buried beneath the wreckage, there remains a part of us waiting quietly to be seen again. The discovery began with a broken suitcase. One rainy afternoon in March, Margaret noticed an elderly man struggling with a damaged suitcase in the boarding house lobby. The zipper had split completely open, spilling clothes onto the floor. "Oh dear," the man muttered helplessly. Margaret knelt carefully beside him, despite the ache in her knees. "May I?" Within minutes, her experienced hands had temporarily repaired the zipper using a small sewing kit she carried everywhere. The man stared at her with astonishment. "You fixed it faster than the shop downtown." Margaret smiled modestly. Just an old habit. Elena witnessed the entire exchange from the stairway. 2 days later, she burst into Margaret's room holding her phone excitedly. "You're famous!" Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry?" Elena showed her a short video she had secretly recorded of Margaret repairing the suitcase. She had posted it online with the caption, "This sweet woman in my boarding house can fix almost anything with thread." The video had thousands of views. Margaret stared at the tiny glowing screen in disbelief. Why would anyone watch that? "Because people miss things made with care," Elena replied. Over the next week, strangers began bringing small repair jobs to the boarding house. Torn jackets, broken hems, old blankets needing mending. Margaret charged almost nothing because she felt embarrassed accepting money. But something remarkable happened. People stayed. They talked while she worked. A young mother cried while explaining the baby blanket Margaret repaired had belonged to her late father. A teenager brought an old denim jacket covered in patches from concerts he attended with his mother before she passed away. Margaret listened to everyone, and slowly, without realizing it, she began stitching together more than fabric. She was mending loneliness. One evening, Elena sat across from Margaret at the tiny kitchen table downstairs. "You know this could become something bigger." Margaret shook her head immediately. "I'm too old for big things. That's exactly why people love you." Margaret laughed softly at the absurdity of it. But Elena persisted. She created a social media page called Margaret's Mending Hands and began posting photos of repaired items alongside the stories behind them. The internet responded with overwhelming emotion. People wrote comments like, "She reminds me of my grandmother." "This made me cry. I wish someone cared about things this way now." Requests began arriving from neighboring towns, then from other states. Margaret became overwhelmed. "I can't possibly do all this," she insisted one evening, while surrounded by packages. Elena grinned. "Then maybe you don't." A week later, something even stranger happened. A journalist from a small national magazine contacted them requesting an interview. Margaret nearly refused. "I have nothing interesting to say." But the journalist, a warm, middle-aged woman named Diane, visited anyway. She spent hours speaking with Margaret in the boarding house dining room while rain tapped softly against the windows. "What do you think people respond to most?" Diane asked. Margaret considered carefully. "I think people are tired of throwing things away," she said quietly. "Objects carry love sometimes, memories. Repairing something feels like respecting the life attached to it." Diane's article was published under the title, "The Woman Who Repairs More Than Clothes." Everything changed after that. The story spread rapidly online. Television producers called. Local businesses offered workspace. People mailed letters from across the country, sharing stories of grief, loss, and treasured objects needing care. Margaret read every single letter. One afternoon, a package arrived unlike the others. No return address. Inside rested a faded quilt Margaret instantly recognized. Her breath caught painfully. It was the quilt she made with her mother when she was 16 years old. The quilt lost decades earlier during a flood in her childhood hometown. Tucked inside was a note written in shaky handwriting. "I believe this belonged to your family. My father kept it after helping during the flood many years ago. Before he died, he asked me to return it if I could ever find the rightful owner." Margaret touched the worn fabric with trembling fingers. Tiny stitched stars, blue thread, her mother's careful patterns. She began crying before she even realized it. Elena wrapped her arms around her silently. But the true twist had not arrived yet. Folded deep within the quilt's lining, Margaret discovered something hidden between the layers. An envelope, old, yellowed, sealed. Inside was a letter addressed to her mother in handwriting Margaret did not recognize. The letter revealed a secret buried for over 60 years. Margaret's mother had inherited ownership shares in a large piece of lakeside property from a distant relative shortly before her death. The legal documents attached proved the shares still existed because nobody ever claimed them after the flood scattered family records. Margaret stared at the papers in disbelief. The land described in the documents was now part of an expensive lakeside development project worth millions. "That can't be real," she whispered. But it was. After weeks of legal investigation, attorneys confirmed the documents were legitimate. Margaret was the surviving heir. The value of the shares exceeded anything she could have imagined. News spread quickly. Suddenly, people treated her differently. Too differently. Bank representatives, who once dismissed her, now called politely offering assistance. Reporters appeared outside the boarding house. Distant relatives resurfaced with forced smiles and awkward affection. Margaret hated every second of it. One evening she sat alone in the common room, clutching Henry's photograph. "I don't understand why this is happening," she whispered. Elena sat beside her. Maybe life is finally giving something back. But Margaret wasn't sure she trusted it. After so much loss, hope itself had become frightening. Lawyers explained numbers Margaret could barely comprehend. Investment accounts, property evaluations, tax structures. The words washed over her like another language. One attorney smiled broadly while speaking about financial opportunities. Margaret interrupted quietly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If a person loses everything for long enough, how do they know this isn't just another thing waiting to disappear?" The attorney fell silent. That was the problem. Margaret no longer trusted happiness. She moved temporarily into a modest apartment, paid for by the legal settlement process, but she kept expecting someone to knock on the door and announce there had been some terrible mistake. At night, she still folded her clothes carefully, like someone living in borrowed space. Elena tried encouraging her. "You could buy another house." Margaret shook her head. "A house isn't the same as a home." The article and interviews continued spreading online, and strangers began recognizing her in grocery stores. "You're the mending lady," they said warmly. Margaret smiled politely, though the attention exhausted her. One afternoon, a television producer invited her to host a crafting program focused on repairing sentimental items and sharing personal stories. The salary alone would guarantee comfort for the rest of her life. Margaret almost declined immediately. "I'm too old for television." Elena laughed. "You keep saying that as if age is some kind of crime. But what if I embarrass myself? What if you help people?" That question lingered. Meanwhile, some people reacted cruelly. A former relative accused her publicly of hiding the inheritance for selfish reasons. Online commenters argued she didn't deserve the sudden fortune simply because of luck. Margaret read those comments late one evening and quietly closed her laptop. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. Elena looked horrified. "You survived losing everything and still spent your last years helping strangers. Don't let bitter people rewrite your story." But doubt settled deeply inside Margaret. She had spent months believing her life was ending. Now everyone expected her to transform overnight into someone brave and confident. The truth was much messier. One afternoon, she visited the lakeside property connected to the inheritance. Expensive homes now overlooked the water where wild grass once grew decades earlier. Margaret stood there silently while cold wind moved through the trees. A memory surfaced suddenly. Her mother laughing beside a picnic blanket. Her father teaching her how to skip stones. The smell of lemonade and sun-warmed grass. Margaret closed her eyes. Money was never truly the miracle. Memory was. For the first time in years, she felt connected not only to loss, but also to belonging. Later that evening, she sat with Elena drinking tea near the apartment window. "What if I don't know how to live this new life?" Margaret admitted softly. Elena smiled gently. "Maybe you don't need a new life. Maybe you just need to continue being yourself somewhere brighter." Several days later, the television producer visited Margaret personally. He was younger than she expected, nervous and sincere. "My mother watched your interview," he explained. "She passed away last year. Before she died, she repaired old wedding dresses from her basement. Watching you reminded me of her." Margaret listened quietly. "We don't want some flashy show," he continued. "We want something honest. Something that reminds people broken things still have value." Those words settled deep inside her chest. Broken things still have value. That night, Margaret dreamed about Henry for the first time in months. In the dream, he sat on the porch of their old cottage, smiling quietly, while wind moved through the lavender bushes. "You're still here," she whispered. "No," Dream Henry replied gently, "but you are." Margaret woke with tears on her cheeks. And perhaps that was the moment everything truly changed. Fear did not vanish overnight, but hope finally spoke louder. The first recording day terrified her. Margaret stood backstage, gripping a teacup so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Studio lights glowed beyond the curtains, while crew members hurried around, carrying cables and clipboards. "I can't do this," she whispered. Elena adjusted Margaret's collar gently. "You already are." The show's set resembled a warm sewing room rather than a television studio. Wooden shelves, soft yellow lamps, baskets of fabric, framed photographs donated by viewers. Margaret relaxed slightly, seeing it. Then the cameras rolled. Her first guest was a widower named Thomas, who brought in his late wife's coat with a torn sleeve. Margaret listened while he described how his wife wore it every winter for 22 years. "She always kept peppermints in the pocket," he said with trembling laughter. Margaret repaired the coat carefully while speaking to him the same way she once spoke to lonely library children and grieving neighbors, softly, fully present. By the end of the episode, half the crew was crying. The show became unexpectedly popular, not because of dramatic performances or polished production, because Margaret felt real. Viewers wrote letters describing how her calm voice comforted them during grief, illness, divorce, loneliness. Elderly people especially thanked her for making aging appear meaningful rather than invisible. Within a year, Margaret's financial struggles disappeared completely, but more importantly, purpose returned. She created community workshops teaching sewing and repair skills to seniors who felt forgotten by the world. She hired widows, retirees, and older workers, often ignored by employers. Laughter slowly returned to her life. Real laughter, the kind that surprises you after years of silence. Still, one final obstacle remained. Margaret had never returned to the lake where her cottage once stood. Part of her feared the pain would swallow her whole. But one spring morning, she drove there alone. The construction project had transformed the area entirely. Elegant homes lined the shore now. The old trees were mostly gone. Margaret stepped out slowly. For several long moments, she simply stood beside the water, listening to wind ripple across the lake. Then something caught her attention. Near the edge of the property, untouched by construction, stood one surviving lavender bush from her old garden, small, wild, blooming stubbornly against the odds. Margaret knelt beside it with tears in her eyes. She touched the purple flowers gently and laughed through her crying. Of course, life would leave something behind. That afternoon, she made a decision. Using part of her inheritance, Margaret purchased a nearby building overlooking the lake and transformed it into a community center called the Lavender House. It offered free meals, crafting classes, grief support groups, and temporary housing assistance for elderly people facing financial hardship. No one should lose everything alone, she told reporters quietly during the opening ceremony. People traveled from far away just to meet her, but Margaret always remained herself. She still drank coffee with nutmeg every morning, still wore soft cardigans with pockets full of thread, still spoke kindly to cashiers and nervous strangers. One rainy evening after closing the center, Margaret sat alone on the porch, watching water shimmer beneath distant streetlights. Elena joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You know," Elena smiled, "you changed a lot of lives." Margaret shook her head gently. "No, people changed mine." The wind carried the faint smell of lavender through the air. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sound of rain tapping softly against the roof. For the first time in years, she felt connected not only to loss but also to belonging. Later that evening, she sat with Elena drinking tea near the apartment window. "What if I don't know how to live this new life?" Margaret admitted softly. Elena smiled gently. "Maybe you don't need a new life. Maybe you just need to continue being yourself somewhere brighter." Several days later, the television producer visited Margaret personally. He was younger than she expected, nervous and sincere. "My mother watched your interview," he explained. "She passed away last year. Before she died, she repaired old wedding dresses from her basement. Watching you reminded me of her." Margaret listened quietly. "We don't want some flashy show," he continued. "We want something honest, something that reminds people broken things still have value." Those words settled deep inside her chest. Broken things still have value? That night, Margaret dreamed about Henry for the first time in months. In the dream, he sat on the porch of their old cottage, smiling quietly while wind moved through the lavender bushes. "You're still here," she whispered. "No," Dream Henry replied gently, "but you are." Margaret woke with tears on her cheeks, and perhaps that was the moment everything truly changed. Fear did not vanish overnight, but hope finally spoke louder. The first recording day terrified her. Margaret stood backstage, gripping a teacup so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Studio lights glowed beyond the curtains while crew members hurried around carrying cables and clipboards. "I can't do this," she whispered. Elena adjusted Margaret's collar gently. "You already are." The show's set resembled a warm sewing room rather than a television studio. Wooden shelves, soft yellow lamps, baskets of fabric, framed photographs donated by viewers. Margaret relaxed slightly seeing it. Then the cameras rolled. Her first guest was a widower named Thomas, who brought in his late wife's coat with a torn sleeve. Margaret listened while he described how his wife wore it every winter for 22 years. "She always kept peppermints in the pocket," he said with trembling laughter. Margaret repaired the coat carefully while speaking to him the same way she once spoke to lonely library children and grieving neighbors. Softly, fully present. By the end of the episode, half the crew was crying. The show became unexpectedly popular, not because of dramatic performances or polished production, because Margaret felt real. Viewers wrote letters describing how her calm voice comforted them during grief, illness, divorce, loneliness. Elderly people especially thanked her for making aging appear meaningful rather than invisible. Within a year, Margaret's financial struggles disappeared completely. But more importantly, purpose returned. She created community workshops teaching sewing and repair skills to seniors who felt forgotten by the world. She hired widows, retirees, and older workers often ignored by employers. Laughter slowly returned to her life. Real laughter. The kind that surprises you after years of silence. Still, one final obstacle remained. Margaret had never returned to the lake where her cottage once stood. Part of her feared the pain would swallow her whole. But one spring morning, she drove there alone. The construction project had transformed the area entirely. Elegant homes lined the shore now. The old trees were mostly gone. Margaret stepped out slowly. For several long moments, she simply stood beside the water, listening to wind ripple across the lake. Then something caught her attention. Near the edge of the property, untouched by construction, stood one surviving lavender bush from her old garden. Small, wild, blooming stubbornly against the odds. Margaret knelt beside it with tears in her eyes. She touched the purple flowers gently and laughed through her crying. Of course, life would leave something behind. That afternoon, she made a decision. Using part of her inheritance, Margaret purchased a nearby building overlooking the lake and transformed it into a community center called the Lavender House. It offered free meals, crafting classes, grief support groups, and temporary housing assistance for elderly people facing financial hardship. No one should lose everything alone, she told reporters quietly during the opening ceremony. People traveled from far away just to meet her, but Margaret always remained herself. She still drank coffee with nutmeg every morning, still wore soft cardigans with pockets full of thread, still spoke kindly to cashiers and nervous strangers. One rainy evening after closing the center, Margaret sat alone on the porch, watching water shimmer beneath distant streetlights. Elena joined her carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You know," Elena smiled, "you changed a lot of lives." Margaret shook her head gently. "No, people changed mine." The wind carried the faint smell of lavender through the air. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sound of rain tapping softly against the roof. For the first time in many years, she no longer feared tomorrow. At 78 years old, Margaret finally understood something grief had hidden from her for far too long. A person's worth is not measured by what they own, what they lose, or even how much pain they survive. It is measured by how much warmth they leave behind in the lives of others. Years later, children still visited the Lavender House after school to hear Margaret tell stories beside the fireplace. Elderly visitors gathered around sewing tables, sharing memories over tea and warm bread. Lonely people arrived carrying broken belongings and often left carrying something far more important: hope. And every spring, lavender bloomed along the lakeside path outside the center, swaying gently in the wind like tiny reminders that life can grow again even after the harshest winter. Margaret kept Henry's photograph beside her favorite chair until the very end. Sometimes she still spoke to him quietly at night. "You would have loved this place," she whispered once while snow fell softly outside. And somehow, in the silence that followed, she felt certain he already knew. You might wonder why some people survive unbearable loss while others disappear beneath it. Perhaps the answer is simpler than we think. Sometimes survival begins with one small kindness, one song through a floorboard, one stranger who notices another person's pain, one moment where someone decides the story is not over yet. Margaret Ellis lost her home, her security, and nearly her will to keep living. But in losing everything familiar, she discovered something unexpected waiting beneath the ruins. Not fortune, not fame, herself. And maybe that is life's strangest miracle of all. That even after heartbreak empties our hands completely, the human heart still somehow finds ways to carry light. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.